The rain in the city of Okavan didn't just fall, it felt like a heavy, cold curtain trying to hide the secrets of the back streets. Elias, a 21-year-old student whose life had become a series of unpaid bills and missed meals, walked down Blackwood Lane. The streetlights flickered with a dying yellow glow, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to crawl up the damp brick walls. At the very end of the lane stood House No. 66. It was a Victorian relic, a jagged tooth of stone and rotting wood that looked like it belonged to another century. The windows were like hollow eyes, staring into the fog. Elias had seen the advertisement on a torn piece of paper at the library. Room for rent. Cheap. No questions asked. Before Elias could even raise his hand to knock, the heavy oak door groaned open. Standing in the dim hallway was Mr. Vane. He was unnervingly tall, his frame so thin it looked like his skin was stretched over a skeleton of rusted iron. He wore a pinstripe suit that smelled of formaldehyde and dry earth. "You're here for the room." Vane didn't ask, he stated it. His voice was a low, rasping vibration that made the hair on Elias's arms stand up. "Yes," Elias swallowed hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Is it still available?" Vane stepped aside, gesturing for Elias to enter. The air inside was thick with the scent of old paper and something metallic, like dried blood. As they climbed the spiral staircase, Elias noticed that the floorboards didn't just creak. They sounded like they were whispering in a language he didn't understand. Every portrait they passed featured a person whose eyes had been meticulously scratched out of the canvas. "Third floor," Vane said, stopping at the end of a dark corridor. He pushed open a heavy door. $50 a month. Heat, water, and silence are included. Elias stepped inside. The room was unnaturally large. There was a plush velvet bed that looked like a coffin, a mahogany desk, and a single window that faced a solid brick wall. But what dominated the entire space was a massive grandfather clock standing against the far wall. It was carved from wood so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. At its peak sat a carved demon with its mouth open in a silent, eternal scream. "The rules are simple, Elias," Vane said, his shadow stretching across the ceiling like a predatory bird. "You may stay as long as you like, but you must never, under any circumstances, look at that clock after the stroke of midnight. Do not track the time. Do not count the seconds. To look is to invite a debt you cannot pay." Elias looked at the clock. The pendulum swung with a heavy, wet thud. 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 It sounded less like a machine and more like a heart beating in a jar of oil. "I can do that," Elias whispered. At that price, he could do anything. For the first week, Elias kept his promise. He worked 2 jobs, returning to the room exhausted. He would draw the curtains, turn off the dim lamp, and bury his head under the pillows. He was terrified of the clock, yet it fascinated him. By the 8th night, the atmosphere changed. The silence of Blackwood Lane became absolute. It wasn't the silence of a quiet night, it was a vacuum. as if the world outside House No 66 had ceased to exist. Elias lay awake. His phone had died an hour ago, despite being fully charged. The darkness in the room felt heavy, like it was pressing against his chest. He could feel the clock watching him. The thud-thud of the pendulum was growing louder, vibrating through the bed frame and into his very bones. Thump, thump, thump. Suddenly, a drop of liquid hit his cheek. It was cold. He wiped it away and realized it was thick. He turned on his flashlight. The ceiling was sweating. Dark, viscous droplets of what looked like black bile were seeping from the plaster, falling in perfect rhythm with the clock. Elias, a voice whispered. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the air itself. Is it midnight yet? How many seconds have passed since you closed your eyes? Are you sure you're still in the same year? The psychological pressure was agonizing. He felt like his brain was being squeezed. He tried to think of his mother, his friends, his life before this room, but his memories felt like sand slipping through his fingers. All he could focus on was the rhythm. Mors tempus, mors tempus. The clock began to chime. 1. The sound was a deep, guttural roar that shook the glass in the window. 2. The shadows in the corner of the room began to stand up. They weren't just dark spots. They were three-dimensional figures, faceless and tall, leaning over his bed. 3. Elias felt a burning heat in his eyes. The temptation to look was no longer a choice. It was a physical compulsion, like a fish gasping for water. He needed to know if the demon on the clock was still smiling. As the 12th chime tore through the room, Elias snapped. He sat up and stared directly into the face of the grandfather clock. The moment his eyes locked onto the clock face, the world didn't just change, it inverted. The demon at the top didn't just move, it inhaled. The white face of the clock began to glow with a sickly, radioactive light. The numbers, Roman numerals, detached themselves from the surface and began to float in the air, spinning around Elias like jagged razor blades. The hands of the clock, which he had thought were metal, were actually sharpened human bones. They began to spin backward at a speed that defied physics. Elias tried to jump off the bed, but he fell into a void. The floor had turned into a liquid black mirror. He looked at his hands and screamed. His skin was wrinkling and smoothing simultaneously. He saw his hair grow long, then fall out, then grow back as the blonde curls of his childhood. He was being shredded by time. You have looked at the great counter. A voice boomed. Elias looked up. The room was gone. He was standing on a narrow platform made of thousands of interlocking gears. Above him, a sky of burning orange gears grinded against each other, raining sparks of molten brass. In front of him stood the landlord. But it wasn't Mr. Vane. It was a creature of pure clockwork and rotting flesh. Its chest was a transparent cage where a human heart was hooked up to a series of pulsing tubes. In this realm, time is the only currency. The creature hissed, its voice echoing like a million ticking watches. You have consumed years of my silence. Now, you will provide the seconds for my eternity. The creature pointed to the distance. Elias saw them then, thousands of glass jars lined up on endless shelves of bone. Inside each jar was a human face, frozen in a scream. These were the tenants. Every time the clock in the room ticked, one of these faces would age 100 years and then revert to an infant in a second of pure agony. Elias tried to run, but the gears beneath his feet began to spin. He was pulled toward a massive, vertical opening, the internal mechanism of the grandfather clock. He saw his own life flashing before his eyes, but it was being played backward. He saw his graduation, his first heartbreak, his father's funeral, all of it being sucked into the gears and crushed into a fine, glowing dust. The devil wasn't just taking his life, he was eating his history. Please, Elias begged, his voice now high-pitched like a child's. I'll do anything. I'll pay. I'll find more tenants. The creature paused. Its clock face eyes whirred as they focused on him. A bargain? The last one who offered a bargain is currently the pendulum. The creature gestured to a massive swinging blade at the center of the abyss. Tied to the blade was the withered, screaming body of a man who looked suspiciously like the previous student who had gone missing in Oakoven. Each time he swung, his body hit a wall of spikes. Thump, thump, thump. The debt must be paid in blood and minutes, the creature whispered. Elias felt a cold, metallic hand wrap around his throat. He was pushed into a small, cramped wooden box. It was the inside of the clock. Through the cracks in the wood, he could see the room back at house no 66. He saw a new person entering the room. A young woman, looking tired and desperate. He saw Mr. Vane standing at the door, offering the same $50 rent. Elias tried to bang on the wood, to scream, "Don't stay here," but all that came out of his mouth was a rhythmic sound. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. He realized, with a horror that surpassed death, that he was no longer Elias. He was the mechanism. He was the sound. He was the reason the next tenant would lose their mind. Back in the room, the girl looked at the clock. She felt a strange shiver. She thought she heard a muffled cry coming from inside the wood, but she brushed it off as the wind. Mr. Vane smiled, his dark eyes reflecting the fire of a world that didn't exist. Sleep well, my dear. Just remember, never look at the clock after midnight. Outside, the rain continued to wash over Blackwood Lane, erasing the footprints of everyone who had ever entered house no 66, leaving only the sound of a heart beating behind a wooden door.